The Greeks were the first to rebel against the Ottoman shackles. Unrest began in 1821, and it soon resulted in a war of independence. After the uprising in Greece, the Orthodox Christians in the empire saw themselves as one people, with a common language and history, as a Greek nation that wanted an independent state. It was an example for the other minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and one that had huge explosive power. The empire's enemies were aware of this. Under the pretext of wanting to protect Christians who were being oppressed in this Muslim empire, France, Great Britain and Russia supported the Greek separatists. They all fancied Ottoman territories, in Europe and in Asia. Greece was of strategic significance thanks to its central location on the Mediterranean, particularly for Russia, which wanted to control shipping routes in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1829, France, Britain and Russia convened in London to negotiate Greece's independence. This independence cut a big hole in the Ottoman Empire. The spark quickly spread. Encouraged by Russia, the Serbs and Romanians rose up, achieving autonomy. They were still part of the Ottoman Empire, but they were on their way to independence. How could this tide be stopped? In 1839, Sultan Abdul-Majid initiated a hitherto unseen reform process, the Tanzimat. It promised freedom, security, and legal and fiscal equality for all Ottoman subjects, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, as if it were still possible to create an Ottoman citizen who was attached to the empire. Little by little, the Ottoman millets were transformed into nations, nations whose foundations were religious identity and language. The Balkans remain shaped by these factors today. In Bosnia, a Slavic people sharing the same Slavic language split into opposing nations. Orthodox Christians declared themselves to be Serbs, whereupon Muslims demanded their own identity. Not Serbs or Ottomans, but Bosniaks. A rebellion broke out among Serbian peasants in rural Bosnia in 1875. It heightened the break between the peoples. Christian peasants took up arms all across the Balkans. Irregular Ottoman soldiers, the Bashi Bazouks, brutally put down the revolts. They committed countless massacres in Bulgaria, reported in the Western press. Europe took the side of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. The Turks were painted as being the bad side and were accused of terrible atrocities, while no mention was made of what was being done to Muslim groups in the Balkans. The situation came to a head in 1876. The Bosnian revolt had become the crisis in the East. The Ottoman power was faltering. The ruling Sultan, Abdulaziz in Istanbul, was overthrown. His successor, Murad V, was considered insane. In August 1876, his brother Abdul Hamid II came to power. He received the Sword of Osman, the founder of the dynasty, in the Eyüp Sultan Mosque. He was 34 years old when he became the 34th Ottoman Sultan. Abdul Hamid made the liberals' dream come true. There was to be a constitution, elections, a parliament. The equality of all subjects, of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, was left untouched. Did he believe he could stem the nationalist tide in the Balkans and the call of the European powers for reforms this way? His illusions were short-lived. In April 1877, Russia declared war. The Turks were defeated in just a few weeks. Russia planned to break up the empire, but neither France nor Britain nor Austro-Hungary wanted to allow Russia to get all the spoils for itself. In June 1878, the major European powers convened at a congress in Berlin. The Ottomans were represented too, as observers. They were allowed no say in the negotiations. The big haggle began. As the victorious power, Russia claimed territories in the Caucasus. It achieved the formation of a new Christian state, Bulgaria. It was officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but in reality Russia had the say there. Romania, Montenegro and Serbia finally achieved independence. Bosnia-Herzegovina was Austro-Hungary's counterweight to the Russian influence in the Balkans. Abdul Hamid's empire lost more than 200,000 square kilometers in Europe. After the war and the humiliation in Berlin, Abdul Hamid's liberal intermezzo was over. He got rid of the constitution of 1876 and now ruled alone as a despot, albeit an enlightened one. Sultan Abdul Hamid still wanted to save the empire. He wanted to add the achievements of the West to Oriental civilization, he said. Under his reign, the army and administration, the judicial system, trade and infrastructure were all modernized. Education was prioritised. Military academies and medical and legal faculties were established throughout the empire. In 1888, passengers enjoyed their first journey on the Orient Express, Istanbul to Paris in just 3 days. Travellers flooded in, and with them their Western fashions and influences. The Europeans were also interested in the continued existence of the Ottoman Empire. France and Great Britain in particular had invested in trade, in railway companies and in mines. A kind of central bank was established when the Imperial Ottoman Bank was set up with French and British capital, a leading position that was further enhanced by the capitulation system, treaties dating from the 16th century that gave the Europeans significant privileges, such as the freedom to trade and tax exemptions in the Ottoman Empire. "These capitulations are a violation of our rights," wrote Sultan Abdul Hamid. But what could he do? His scope for action was limited. When he came to power, the state was bankrupt and unable to service its debts on the French and British markets. In 1881, his power was further curtailed by the formation of a special administration for state debts. For a long time, France and Britain were the guarantors of stability in the Ottoman Empire. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, their priorities changed. European imperialism had reached its climax. It needed new resources and new markets. After conquering Ottoman Algeria, France invaded Tunisia in 1881. The following year, Great Britain occupied Egypt. The Suez Canal brought it closer to its colonial empire in India. The Ottomans saw it as a betrayal, but for one power that had hitherto stood on the sidelines, it was an opportunity to join the conversation. In 1889, Kaiser Wilhelm II went to Istanbul for a state visit, where he was received with great pomp and circumstance by Sultan Abdul Hamid. As a symbol of their new friendship, the two rulers hatched plans for a new railway line. It was to run from Berlin to Baghdad, to Mesopotamia, to the Persian Gulf and its oil fields, on the doorstep of the British area of influence. The Kaiser later engaged in further symbolic actions during a trip to the Holy Land. In Damascus, he officially declared himself a friend and protector of the Muslim peoples. A clever political move at a time when Sultan Abdul Hamid was putting Islam centre stage, politically and strategically. Abdul Hamid was not just a worldly leader, he was also a caliph, a spiritual leader of the Sunni faithful. This honour went back to the 16th century when the holy sites of Mecca and Medina were conquered by the Ottomans. Abdul Hamid was to use this role to make Islam the new foundation of his empire, a realm with a new direction, whose population was now 3/4 Muslim. In 1900, in honour of his anniversary in office, Abdul Hamid began with the construction of the Hejaz Railway from Istanbul to Mecca. It portrayed the Ottomans as the guardians of pilgrimage, transcending their imperial borders. The caliph's policies largely played out within the Ottoman Empire. Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Hejaz, Yemen. The Sultan's attention had returned to the long-neglected Arab provinces. The railway brought them closer to the centre of the empire. Schools and academies were opened. The local elites were encouraged and incorporated into the army and administration. Even though calls for autonomy and cultural renewal were making themselves heard in Beirut and Damascus, the Arab provinces remained loyal to the empire. In eastern Anatolia, meanwhile, one Christian minority was pursuing nationalist goals, the Armenians. Scattered across the Ottoman, Russian and Persian empires, they focused on their religion, their language and their ancient history. The Ottomans saw it as a threat at the heart of what they viewed as the core of their identity: Anatolian, Turkish, Muslim. A rebellion broke out in Sasson in 1894. The Armenian population was massacred in retribution. It was a prelude to the genocide of 1915. Europe was outraged. Caricatures in the press nicknamed Abdul Hamid the Red Sultan, a bloodthirsty butcher. But European governments didn't get involved. The Armenians, who had officially been under their protection since the Berlin Congress, were left to their fate. The empire reoriented itself towards Anatolia and Asia Minor. In the Balkans, meanwhile, its collapse was fast approaching. Serbian, Greek and Bulgarian nationalists clashed in its last European territory, in Macedonia. The answer comes from the ranks of the Ottoman army. On the 3rd of July 1908, a group of young officers mutinied in Thessaloniki. Like all the Ottoman troops, they were Muslim. They were members of the Committee of Union and Progress, the largest opposition to the Sultan. They proclaimed their Turkish identity. Humiliated by the defeats and the successive retreat of the empire, they wanted to put an end to Abdul Hamid's authoritarian regime and save the empire, calling themselves the Young Turks. Within 3 weeks, they'd set the Balkans on fire. The Sultan was under pressure to act. On the 23rd of July, Abdul Hamid had to reinstate the liberal constitution of 1876, which he had set aside in 1878. The mood was euphoric, a hitherto unknown feeling of freedom and fraternity. In a famous speech, Enver Pasha, one of the revolutionary leaders, said, "We're all brothers. There are no Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbs, Romanians or Jews in our empire. We're proud to be Ottomans." The nationalist wave that had been triggered a century earlier in Greece had finally arrived in the hard Turkish core of the Ottoman Empire. It was close to the end. In the ensuing chaos, Bulgaria, egged on by Russia, declared its independence. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Ottomans were defeated. The Balkans were just waiting for a sign to turn against the Porte completely. It came from Libyan Tripolitania. Italy had set its sights on this last Ottoman province on the African continent. Rome took the offensive in September 1911. The Ottoman army resisted but was unable to halt the Italian advance. The occupation of Libya revealed the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. This encouraged Serbia, Montenegro, Greece and Bulgaria to form the Balkan League. In October 1912, they declared war on the empire. Albanian mercenaries joined them. The Ottoman army, already weakened from Libya, was destroyed. Thessaloniki, the city of the 1908 revolution, was occupied by Greek troops. The Balkan nations had defeated the Ottoman Empire. But what was to become of Ottoman Macedonia? Bulgaria had different ambitions from Greece and Serbia, and they were all against the Albanians. A new war broke out, this time between the parties that had only recently been allies. It was no longer a war of liberation by the people against their oppressors. Now it was a war between nations. They all fought for themselves and were prepared to destroy all the others, all those who spoke a different language or had a different faith. Entire villages were massacred. People were displaced, raped and forcibly converted. Areas were to be cleansed with all means possible. More than 400,000 people were forcibly moved, most of them Muslims. The drawing of the borders fueled brutal behaviour, and a 1913 peace treaty sparked off another round of conflicts. An independent Albania was created, but its borders were disputed. Kosovo, the site of the Albanian rebellion, was given to Serbia. It was a victory steeped in symbolism. The Serbs saw this as compensation for their humiliation at the hands of the Ottomans at the Battle of the Kosovo Field in 1389. The Ottomans' victory had come to symbolize their rule over the Balkans. In 1989, Slobodan Milosevic, Yugoslavia's Serbian president, evoked a new Serbian nationalism on the 600th anniversary of this battle. It was the start of the wars that would tear former Yugoslavia apart. The last took place in Kosovo in 1998, a war aimed at driving the Albanians out of territory claimed by Serbia for once and for all. In 2003, Kosovo became the last state to have been created in Europe. The history of the Ottoman Empire in Europe had ended in 1913. The rest of its story was to be played out in the Middle East, and the impending First World War would accelerate its end.